On the 15th of July 2009, a 30-year-old man named Teo Bang Hok walked into the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission's Selangor headquarters in Shah Alam, Malaysia. Teo was a former journalist, but now he was serving as a political aide to a rising state assemblyman in Selangor's newly elected government. Under that new administration was a man named Ian Young Hyen, while a fresh face in the opposition coalition, someone who was rather vocal about transparency and reform. However, just a day earlier, officers from the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, or MAC, had raided Ian Young's office. They were investigating the alleged misuse of public funds, and now they wanted to speak with Teo, which is why he was here today. Teo had been called in as a witness to assist in an ongoing investigation, but that evening he didn't return home. The police and state investigators would later suggest that Teo's death may have involved foul play, but the MACC denied everything. They insisted that Teo's death was a case of suicide. This would become one of Malaysia's most explosive political deaths in modern history. A case that would drag courtrooms, government agencies, and public trust straight into the spotlight. Teo's family remained firm. There were no signs he was struggling, no indication he was thinking of taking his own life. The court would later agree, stating that his death was likely the result of foul play, and yet the MACC continued to insist that it was suicide. So if Teo didn't jump, then what really happened on the 14th floor of the MACC building? Things are not adding up. Someone must be lying. To understand how Teo ended up in that building, we need to go back long before the courtrooms, raids, or press conferences. Teo was born on April 20th, 1979 in Malacca. He was the third of 4 children in a modest, tight-knit family. His father, Teo Lang Hui, drove a taxi for a living. His mother, Tang Shur, stayed home to care for the family. His parents were not wealthy people, but they did give their children what they could: structure, support, and the belief that if you worked hard and stayed honest, you could make something of yourself. From a young age, Teo was the kind of boy who paid attention to the world around him. He wasn't loud or rebellious. He listened more than he spoke. Teachers remembered him thoughtful and well-mannered, someone who took pride in doing things properly. He did well in school and eventually earned a place at University Kebang in Malaysia, one of the country's top public universities. Where he majored in communications, university opened up his world. It gave him the tools to articulate what he had long observed in silence. The cracks in the system, the unfairness that others ignored, and the power of information. That's what drew him to journalism after graduation. He believed that if people knew the truth, they'd demand better. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing impact. Teo worked as a journalist for a local Chinese language newspaper. He covered local politics, community issues, and stories that often went unnoticed. His reporting was careful, well-sourced, and grounded in facts. He wasn't one for sensational headlines. He focused on accuracy, on context, on giving people the full picture. But over time, something began to shift. As much as he valued journalism, Teo started to feel that reporting the truth wasn't enough. He wanted to be part of the change, not just document it from the sidelines. Telling the truth was important, but what if he could do more than write about problems? What if he could help solve them? That's when he began to consider politics. He wanted to be closer to the ground, closer to the people. He believed that real change could only come from within the system. So in 2008, he joined the Democratic Action Party, better known as DAP, part of the opposition coalition. It was during this time that he met Ian Young Hyen in Washington, a young first-time candidate with a reputation for integrity and a clear stance on accountability and reform. In March 2008, Malaysia held its 12th general election, and the results shook the country. For more than 5 decades, the ruling coalition Barisan Nasional had held power, was the only government many Malaysians had ever known. It dominated the political landscape with an overwhelming majority election after election, but this time the ground shifted. fueled by growing public frustration over corruption, inequality, and the widening gap between government promises and people's realities. The opposition alliance, known as the Bukatan Rakyat or People's Alliance, began gaining serious traction, and then the unthinkable happened. The opposition didn't just increase its numbers, they made history. They won control of 5 states, including Selangor, the country's most developed and economically significant state. Barisan Nasional, for the first time since independence, lost its 2/3 parliamentary majority. People flooded the streets in celebration. There was a buzz in the air, a feeling that the country was at the edge of something new. For many Malaysians, especially the younger generation, it felt like the beginning of real change. Teo was one of those people. For him, this wasn't just a political shift, it was a personal affirmation. Everything he believed in, transparency, accountability, and the idea that public office should serve the people, finally seemed possible when Ian Young-hai in Washington secured his seat in Selangor. Teo joined him as his political aide. He didn't take the job for status or recognition, he took it because he wanted to help build the kind of country he had spent years writing about. Teo wasn't someone who sought attention. He wasn't on stage delivering speeches or making front-page news. Instead, he worked quietly in the background, handling documents, coordinating with local contractors, and making sure development funds were properly managed for community projects. It was honest, meticulous work, and by all accounts, he took it very seriously. At the time, under the Selangor state government, each assemblyman was given a fixed yearly allocation of 500,000 ringgit. The purpose was to fund small-scale community initiatives, projects meant to directly benefit the people in their constituencies. That money could go toward resurfacing a village road, repairing a public hall, or sponsoring festive events. Sometimes it was as simple as purchasing flags to decorate a neighborhood during National Day celebrations. It wasn't a massive budget, but it was significant, and because it involved public funds, every ringgit had to be accounted for. Receipts, invoices, photographs, everything had to be documented properly before a claim could be approved. That's where Teo came in. One of his responsibilities was to ensure that every funding claim came with proper documentation. The goal was simple: to show that public money was being used exactly where it was meant to be. But even with those safeguards in place, the system didn't escape scrutiny. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, or MAC, started looking into how state assemblymen were spending their annual allocations. One of the projects that caught MACC's eye was a claim for 1,500 Malaysian flags supposedly purchased for a National Day event the year before. The cost submitted was 2,400 ringgit. On the surface, it wasn't unusual. These kinds of claims were routine, and there was documentation to support them. But soon after, whispers began to circulate that the flags had never actually been delivered. That alone was enough to trigger alarm bells. The MACC suspected the claim had been inflated, or worse, completely fabricated. They believed the money might have been pocketed and the flags used as a cover. This was not a case of millions of dollars that had gone missing, just a few thousand ringgit, but the implication was serious. What made this particular investigation even more sensitive was that it involved members of the opposition who now held real power for the first time, and for many within the old guard, their shift was still hard to accept. There were growing concerns that the MACC's investigations were becoming more politically charged, especially when they seemed to target opposition figures more aggressively than those from the ruling coalition. In the case of Ian Young, MACC officers began building their case quickly. On July 14, 2009, they raided his office at the Selangor State Secretariat building. Officers seized documents, reviewed files, and questioned staff members, going over claims line by line. Teo was among those they spoke to that day. He had handled the paperwork, his name was on the claim, and that was enough for them to summon him for questioning the very next day. Teo wasn't under arrest, he wasn't even a suspect, he was just there to help clear up some paperwork, but outside of work he was preparing for something else entirely. For the past 2 years, Teo had been in a steady relationship with So Cherway, a school teacher. The couple eventually got engaged and had planned to register their marriage on July 17th. A wedding photo shoot, honeymoon, and a reception in October were all already in place. When Teo walked into the MAC building on July 15th, his fiancée Sa was already 2 months pregnant. This was supposed to be his last day at work before taking some time off to get married. But Teo never got that chance, and the next time So would see him would be in the mortuary. It's the evening of July 15th, 2009. Teo arrives at the MAC Selangor office in Shah Alam. He checks in as instructed without hesitation. He's not there to defend himself. He's simply a witness, someone called in to clarify a funding claim. He's compliant, polite, and likely expecting to be out within a few hours. But the atmosphere inside the building is different. By that hour, the usual bustle of government offices had faded. It's quiet, dimly lit, with most civil servants gone for the day. Teo is brought into one of the upper floors, the 14th, where the MACC's offices are located. From that point forward, he is no longer reachable. His phone and house keys are taken away at the start of the session, and for reasons never clearly explained, those items are never returned to him. There's no legal representation allowed, no lawyer beside him. He is in a government building, questioned for hours alone. The MACC would later claim that the interview lasted about 9 hours, ending sometime around 3:45 in the morning. That's already well outside standard procedure, especially for someone who isn't a suspect. They say Teo was free to leave after that, but that's where the timeline starts to fall apart. There is no official record of his release, no form signed, no timestamp, no formal exit log, and although there is CCTV footage showing him entering the building earlier that evening, there is no footage of him ever leaving. His phone, which should have been returned to him if he had truly been released, is still with the MACC well into the next day. When asked why he didn't leave, officers later claimed that Teo had voluntarily chosen to stay the night. They said he asked to rest on a sofa in one of their common areas. According to their version of events, he was last seen alive at around 6 a.m. lying down on a couch inside their office on the 14th floor. That is the final confirmed sighting of Teo. Just after 1:30 p.m., a building staff member discovers a body on the 5th floor balcony of the MAC building. It's a jarring sight, unexpected, silent, and horrifying. The body is lying still, sprawled across the concrete, with clear signs of trauma from the fall. Within minutes, word spreads, police arrive, the area is cordoned off. And then the process of identification begins. The body is confirmed to be Teo shortly after the MAC contacts his family. His sister Leland answers the call. She's told there's been an incident, that Teo has died. For a moment, she can't process the words. She assumes it's a mistake. Her brother had only gone in to give a statement. There was no reason for things to go this far. She hangs up shaken and calls their parents. When the news reaches his mother and father, they're devastated. What hurts most isn't just that he's gone, it's the confusion around how and why. There's no explanation, no clear answers, only a body, a call, and the overwhelming sense that something has gone terribly wrong. And for his mother, the grief is mixed with something else. Guilt. She had warned Teo years earlier. When he first told her he wanted to join politics, she told him politics was messy, it was dangerous, it was a game that didn't always reward honesty. But Teo, ever optimistic, had reassured her. He told her he believed in doing the right thing, that he wasn't getting involved for power or influence, that he just wanted to help. But now her son is gone, and no one seems to know how or why. Teo had walked into the MAC building as a witness. By the next day, he was dead, and the people responsible for his safety have more questions than answers. Was this just an unfortunate accident, or did something happen inside that room? Something no one is willing to talk about. In the days that followed Teo's death, his family demanded answers. They wanted to know exactly what happened inside that building, who was with him, and how a man who walked in as a witness ended up dead 9 floors below. But from the very beginning, the response from the authorities was slow and vague. The MACC did eventually make a handful of public statements, all of which denied any wrongdoing and insisted that their officers had followed standard procedure during the interrogation of Teo. They stood by their version of events, saying nothing unlawful had taken place, but aside from that they didn't offer much else. There were no clear explanations, no breakdown of what exactly happened during those hours. Government officials promised there would be a full investigation, but for the family none of it felt urgent. No one seemed to be taking responsibility, and no one seemed willing to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. In response to the growing pressure for answers, officials doubled down on the claim that Teo had taken his own life. But to his family and to many others, that theory didn't make any sense. He had no history of mental health issues, no financial problems, no known conflicts at work. In fact, he was just days away from getting married. His fiancée was 2 months pregnant. He was excited, hopeful, planning a future. The idea that he would suddenly end his life inside a government office on the eve of his wedding just didn't add up. And the more people looked at the facts, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mystery, and someone wasn't telling the truth. Then there were the injuries. Forensic experts noted that Teo had a distinct injury on his neck, one that didn't quite line up with the idea of a fall from height. According to Dr. Pornthaprojanasunan, a renowned forensic pathologist from Thailand, who was brought in as an independent expert, the location of that injury was in a protected area, one that wouldn't typically be harmed in a fall from that height unless the body had landed in an extremely unusual position. In her view, this pointed to a pre-fall injury possibly caused before Teo had fallen out from the 14th floor window. There was also no suicide note, nothing written, typed, or left behind to suggest he had any intention of ending his life. These details began to shift the conversation from whether this was a tragedy to whether it was something else entirely. His fiancée also brought up something that didn't sit right. During the early stages of the investigation, she mentioned a detail that seemed small but unsettling. When Teo's body was found, his shoes were reported to have been scuffed and worn out, but according to so that didn't make sense. She told investigators that Teo had put on a brand new pair that very day that he was summoned to the MAC. She said that he was never the type to rotate shoes for no reason. He would only switch to a new pair when the old ones were completely falling apart. So how did a fresh pair of shoes become so battered in just a matter of hours? To her, things were not adding up, and it was one more reason to believe that something was seriously wrong. These major inconsistencies were what led to the first real step forward, a coroner's inquest. This is a legal process used to determine the cause of an unexplained or sudden death. But the goal wasn't to find someone guilty. It was simply to figure out how Teo died and whether there were signs of foul play. However, what was supposed to be a straightforward inquiry quickly turned into a drawn-out process. The inquest dragged on for more than a year, filled with delays, complications, and conflicting accounts. One by one, MACC officers were called to testify, but instead of providing clarity, their stories began to contradict each other. Some officers couldn't remember key details, others gave different versions of the same events. In some cases, their timelines didn't line up at all. The inconsistencies were glaring, and as the hearings went on, it became harder and harder to tell what actually happened and what was being left out. Then came the forensic problems. As the inquest continued, more troubling details started to surface, especially around how the scene was handled. For one, Teo's bag, which was found near his body, had been moved before any proper see. But the bag wasn't the only thing that raised red flags. There was also the matter of the window. Investigators believed that Teo had fallen from the 14th floor through a window in one of the MACC offices. That window was thought to be the point of exit, but during the inspection of the scene, they noticed something odd. The window handle had been broken and the part that had snapped off was completely missing. No one could explain how or why it had come off. No one could say when it had gone missing, and perhaps most suspicious of all, it was never recovered, not from the scene, not from evidence storage, not from any part of the building. It had simply disappeared. But the most suspicious and perhaps alarming fact of the inquest was that no luminal tests or blood detection procedures were conducted in the room where Teo was last seen. Those tests could have revealed whether there had been a struggle or if Teo had sustained any injuries inside the building before the fall, but they were not conducted, at least not right away. It was only after external pressure, particularly from independent forensic experts, that those tests were finally carried out. But by that point, it may have already been too late. Any crucial evidence could have been lost. The deeper the inquiry went, the more the investigation itself began to look rather compromised. What started out as a search for answers was slowly turning into a story about what had been overlooked or possibly ignored altogether. After more than a year of testimony, hearings, and conflicting accounts, the coroner delivered the final ruling on January 5, 2011. Teo's death was recorded as an open verdict that meant the court couldn't conclude whether his death was a suicide or homicide. In other words, they didn't know. Although the open verdict marked the official end of the inquest, Teo's family and much of the country still felt that the real fight for justice had only just begun. In response to growing public pressure and dissatisfaction with the open verdict, the government agreed to take the next step. They formed a Royal Commission of Inquiry, a special panel tasked with investigating not just how Teo died, but how the MACC conducted itself throughout the interrogation process. The commission was made up of retired judges, legal experts, and senior government figures. Their job was to take a close look at how the MACC operated to determine whether Teo was treated fairly and whether the agency had followed proper legal procedures. Over several months, the commission heard testimonies from witnesses, reviewed forensic reports, and revisited the events that took place inside that building on July 15th and 16th. Some of the findings were deeply troubling. The commission concluded that MAC officers had indeed used harsh and aggressive tactics during Teo's interrogation. And while public records don't explicitly state what these tactics were, the commission described them as relentless, oppressive, and unscrupulous. The pressure placed on Teo, they said, was intense enough to mentally and emotionally break someone down. And based on this, the Royal Commission arrived at its final conclusion that Teo Bang Hak had indeed taken his own life, but only as a direct result of the methods used against him by the MACC officers. To put it simply, they believed he was driven to suicide. Again, not everyone agreed with that conclusion. The people closest to him said the same thing, that Teo was in a good place. He was steady, relaxed, and looking forward to starting the next chapter of his life. There was no reason for him to throw all of that away. No signs that he would ever take such a drastic step and leave everything he had worked so hard for behind. Just when people thought the case couldn't get any murkier, it did. More than a year after Teo's death, authorities suddenly announced they had found a suicide note supposedly written by Teo himself. It was discovered tucked inside one of his notebooks, hidden between the pages. But here's what made people suspicious. This note wasn't found during the initial investigations, not by the MACC, not by the police, not even by the forensic team that first went through his belongings. The note only appeared much later, brought forward by the police in the middle of the ongoing inquest. Naturally, this raised alarm bells. How does something as important as a suicide note go unnoticed for an entire year? Why wasn't it logged or documented when his belongings were first taken in? And why did it suddenly appear right around the time forensic experts started casting doubt on the idea that this was even a suicide to begin with? The handwriting was also disputed. Teo's family said it didn't look like he wrote it. Others said the language felt strange, cold, formal, not in line with how someone in distress would typically express themselves. Even the note's placement raised suspicion. If it was meant to be found, why was it hidden in a notebook sandwiched between unrelated pages? Many saw it as a last-ditch effort by the MACC to steer the narrative and attempt to push the suicide theory just as it was starting to fall apart. In the end, the coroner agreed that the note couldn't be taken at face value, its authenticity couldn't be verified, and the timing of his discovery made it impossible to treat as credible evidence. This note was ultimately dismissed from the inquest, but its appearance left a lasting impression, and not a good one. Instead of answering questions, it only added to the growing belief that someone somewhere was trying to cover something up. As the case dragged on, public trust in the MAC and the government itself began to unravel. People weren't just questioning how Teo Bang Hok died anymore, they were questioning whether the very institutions tasked with protecting the truth were now working to bury it. 3 MAC officers had been identified as Teo's key interrogators. Their names came up repeatedly throughout the inquest and the Royal Commission. But despite everything, despite the inconsistencies, the conflicting testimonies, and the pressure that was reportedly placed on Teo during the interrogation, not a single one of them was prosecuted. Instead, what began to surface was something even more disturbing. Text messages between MACC officers showed one staff member warning another not to lie during their testimony. Several digital devices, including computers and mobile phones, had been wiped or cleared of data before they were handed over to police. But these were not isolated actions, they seemed like coordinated efforts to control the story before anyone else could get a hold of it. And then in 2014, 5 years after Teo's death, the Court of Appeal finally delivered a landmark ruling. They overturned the open verdict. In their findings, the judges stated that Teo Bang Hok's death was the result of unlawful acts committed by persons unknown, including MAC officers who were directly involved in his arrest and interrogation. In plain terms, they concluded that Teo didn't jump out of that window willingly. Something had been done to him, and the MACC had failed in its duty to keep him safe while he was in their custody. This was the clearest judicial acknowledgement yet that Teo Bang Hok's death was not a tragic accident, but something far more serious. But even after that ruling, still no one was held accountable. Not one officer was charged and not one conviction was made. For the Teo family, the years that followed were marked by a painful truth that the system they turned to for justice gave them almost nothing in return. Eventually, the government offered the family a compensation payout. They accepted it, but it was never what they were looking for. What they wanted, what they were promised, was accountability. Instead, they were silenced. Teo's fiancée Socherwi raised their son alone. The life they were supposed to build together never began, and his mother, Tang Shi, went years without ever receiving a clear answer to the one question that haunted her most. How could her son walk into a government building as a witness and never walk out? For a while, it seemed like that question would go unanswered forever, but then in late 2024, 15 years after Teo's death, the case resurfaced. In a powerful move, the High Court ordered the police to finally complete their investigation, and the judge didn't mince his words. He gave the police 6 months to finish what had been delayed for over a decade. This came after Teo's family filed a judicial review arguing that the police had failed to carry out their responsibilities within a reasonable amount of time. And the court agreed. The judge acknowledged just how long the family had been left waiting and made it clear that this case couldn't be left open-ended forever. By the year 2023, the investigation was technically still open, but nothing concrete had come of it. This time, the judge made it clear enough was enough. He described the delay as inexcusable and said bluntly, "This isn't rocket science. There was no reason it should have taken this long." Teo's lawyer Ramapal Singh welcomed the court's decision. He reminded the public that Teo's death happened in 2009, and yet as we approach the middle of 2025, there's still no clear end in sight. To him, the delay is unacceptable. The 6-month deadline that was given to the police is final. The judge has made it clear, had the police failed to deliver, they could be held in contempt of court. After all these years, the question once again sits heavy in the air. What really happened to Teo Bang Hok in the MAC building that led to his death? It's been more than 15 years since Teo Bang was found dead, but for his family, time hasn't made it easier. It hasn't brought peace. His younger sister Teo Leland continues to fight in every interview, every press conference, every court appearance. She's carried her brother's name, refusing to let it disappear from public memory. She once said that her fight is not just for Bang Hok, but for every ordinary Malaysian who deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter their political affiliation or job title. As for So Cherway, the wife of the late Teo Beng, she gave birth to their son not long after his death. Since then, she's raised him quietly away from the spotlight, choosing to shield him from the noise of courtrooms and public debates. She hasn't spoken often, but when she does, her words are steady. All she wants is for her son to grow up knowing the truth, to live in a country where those in power are held accountable and where justice isn't something you have to fight for alone. And while she carries on for the sake of their child, Teo's mother continues to wait. She's never asked for a spotlight, she's never wanted to be the face of any movement. All she's ever wanted was for her son to live a good, honest life, to get married, to have a family, to be happy. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.